Thank you all so much for being here. We're excited about this panel. I'm Ezra Klein. I'm the founder and editor at large of Vox. I live in, thank you. That's very nice. I appreciate that. So as some of you, I guess, know, I live in Washington, D.C. And so it's lovely to be out here where for 2 or 3 days, the conversation is how can things get a little bit better, as opposed to how much worse will everything get. And so the jolt of optimism has been good for me, and I hope it's been good for you, and I'm grateful to the Good Food Institute for putting it together. This is an important panel. This is a panel that is not about the technology that is being built or the future that is being imagined, but the roadblocks that could be put in front of it or the accelerants that could be put in front of it. And we have a great star-studded group. So sitting on my right is Ann Veneman. Ann Veneman, she was the executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, from 2005 to 2010. And she was the US Secretary of Agriculture from 2001 to 2005. On her right is Seth Goldman, the executive chairman of Beyond Meat. You may have eaten some of his wonderful products this week. Before that, he was the founder of Honest Tea, where he's still very involved today. On his right is Jessica Almy, the Director of Policy at the Good Food Institute. And on her right is Deepti Kulkarni, an associate at Sidley Austin LLP, where she works in the food, drug, medical device regulatory practice, and came there from the Office of Chief Counsel at the FDA. So I'm going to begin with a question for everybody, starting with Ann. If you could make any policy change you wanted, if you could just wave your wand, what would it be? What would you do to make sure that the kinds of innovations and inventions and products that we're hearing about here this week have a clear and a fair path to market?
Well, I think that it's one thing to wave a wand, and it's another to look at what's a practical thing to do. And I think, well, some people would say we would love to have some new authorities that are specific to these products that we're talking about, to make sure we have a legal structure and a regulatory structure that lays it out perfectly. I think in the end, the industry is probably going to be better served by working within existing structures. I used a few times in talking about some of these issues about whether or not we should have new legislation, the example of the organic standards. Those, I believe the legislation was passed in 1992. It took 10 full years to get the full set of regulations and finally release them in 2002. I actually released them in the organic label while I was Secretary of Agriculture. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about saying, well, we need to design a whole new legal structure for this. And I think there are clear paths forward in terms of how we can fit the regulation of these products within existing authorities. So, and I think we've certainly seen that with the recent letter that came out jointly signed by Memphis Meats and the North American Meat Institute, which I think is a very strong step forward.
We're going to put a pin in that letter and come back to it. So if you've not heard about that, all your questions will be answered. Seth, what would you like to see?
So first of all, I just want to say how exciting it is to be here. I just heard this great quote this week for the first time. It's a Victor Hugo quote. There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And you can just sense from the energy in this room and the opportunities that are here that this whole gathering reflects an idea whose time has come. So it's really exciting to be part of this community, part of this movement as it takes off. In terms of my policy, I would love a clarification from whatever the relevant authorities are that the meat case needs to be redefined as the protein case. So instead of hamburgers, chicken breast, and turkey, there's just a spectrum of animal-based proteins through to plant-based proteins, and let each product be clearly labeled and defined within that assortment.
Jessica.
So Ezra, I love this question because really one of the missions of the policy department at GFI is to ensure a clear and efficient path to market for clean meat so that the decision is made by consumers whether this industry wins or fails. And we think it will win. So we'll choose this industry. And I agree so much with what you said, Ann. We don't need an act of Congress. We don't need a dramatic shift in policy. The US regulatory regime is robust enough for clean meat to come to market under the existing authorities. So what I would like is for FDA to make a clear statement of how the clean meat industry should engage with the agency to get the necessary sign-offs so that clean meat can come to market in a way that's efficient for the industry and ensures consumer safety and confidence.
And Deepti, you get to back clean up here.
Well, I think all of the speakers have touched on points that are critical for this question. And I think for any new and emerging technology, what's really important to assure success is a clear, predictable, and risk-based framework so that companies know what they have to do to meet the requirements. The public has a good idea of what it is they're eating and that what they're eating is safe and why, and that companies know the point of entry. When do they begin that pathway? With whom? What do I have to show? When can I get to market? And so I think that would be absolutely critical for this technology. And I think, we don't need a magic wand to get there because we have a long history of food law here in the US. And we have new and emerging technologies that have come up. Those technologies did not require a rewriting of the law each and every time. What happened was that you had scientists, researchers, and regulators look at that long history of the law and say, okay, well, this is how these requirements apply to this technology, applying principles that are well understood from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, and from a scientific perspective. And I think we can do that today with this technology.
So what's interesting to me about that is that it's a good bridge to something that I think would help ground the conversation. We're going to talk about a lot of future regulatory questions and decisions, but there's one going on right now where there had been established precedent, and now it's being upended or at least questioned, and that's in the milk category. I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but the government is considering taking away the ability of non-cow, goat, I guess, milks to be called milks, which had not been something under consideration even just a couple of years ago. Jessica, I know Good Food Institute is involved in this case, so give a little background on this. How did this get brought back up for consideration, and why now, and where is it going?
Well, this isn't a new issue. So the dairy producers have been asking for the FDA to crack down on milk terms and other kinds of dairy terms on plant-based products for a long time. And there's even an old petition. There's been, talk about, it was originally soy milk because that was the leading plant-based milk. Now you mostly hear about almond milk, but sort of how these products may infringe on dairy's brand. But if you look at the original standard of identity for milk, FDA thought about using compound names. It specifically looked at flavored
What's a compound
milks.
name?
So like a name like almond milk or soy milk or chocolate milk, where you have a modifier before the word milk. And the FDA made very clear that the standard of identity for cow's milk, which requires the lacteal secretions from a cow, yum, is not necessarily, it can be modified in order to convey to consumers another product that is a milk, but a different kind of milk that doesn't come from the lacteal secretions of a cow. Now, more recently, this has come up in a few different ways, and I do think that the Secretary's recent statement and the FDA's recent interest is a change. But we have seen a bill in Congress, the Dairy Pride Act, and PRIDE stands for something about regular intake of dairy every day. It's an acronym. And so, so this has been an issue, and GFI has actually submitted a petition to FDA to solve this problem, to preserve the freedom of these producers to use terms that consumers understand. But you're right, the commissioner recently has made a point that FDA is revisiting this policy. And I think this comes in the wake of a couple different things. One is plant-based milks are now a very significant segment of the milk market, so they're about 10% of the fluid milk market. So the dairy industry is hurting and sees it as a real threat. But also, it may be linked to clean meat. So there was a recent public meeting on clean meat, and the dairy producers stood up and talked about how FDA needs to preserve the integrity of names, and that clean meat shouldn't, the clean meat shouldn't be able to use meat terms because they know how much it's harmed their milk brand.
Seth, in Missouri,
Yep.
there is, I think, a preview of that battle that's been playing out.
Yeah.
So what's happened there?
So it's interesting. It's the government of Missouri and the government of France, maybe the only thing they agree on, but they both, both governments passed legislation to try to constrict the way meat could be applied to products. And so it was certainly concerning when the legislation was proposed, and we opposed it at the time of it being proposed. Once it was passed.
And how would it have constrained that?
So it would have said, just as it was written, you can't use the term meat or sausage for anything other than the carcass of a slaughtered animal, literally framing it that way. So we chose, to be honest, and I should mention that Beyond Meat has over 100 employees in Missouri. That's where we do most of our production. So it's not just a state where we want to sell product, we want to continue to operate there. And we used the fact that we do operate there as our opportunity to engage in a dialogue with the State Department of Agriculture, and got to an agreement about what would be the proper way to describe the product. And the outcome was a memo from the State Department of Agriculture saying that as long as the product makes very clear it is plant-based meat, which our product does, then we could continue to market it that way. So from our point of view, obviously we would have preferred not to have gone through the whole legislation being passed, but once it was passed, we think the outcome is certainly one we can live with, because it really is no change to our packaging. And hopefully it'll just for us to clarify for the retailers, because we did hear questions from some retailers once it was passed, but before this memo, are we going to be able to sell your product? Now that we have the memo, we're confident we will continue to be able to sell the product.
Secretary, how do the companies coming up in this space protect themselves from being successful enough to become enough of a threat that much more established incumbents organize against them 10 years down the road and try to lock them out of markets or disadvantage their products regulatorily?
Well, I think the industry itself is already becoming aware of and a little nervous about this whole upcoming product that is going to come out of these different new companies. The Cattlemen have filed a petition to the USDA saying we don't want it called meat, which I think is a very interesting strategy, because if it's not called meat, then USDA probably doesn't have authority to regulate it. Well, then we have the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, which really represents both the cattlemen and the processors, coming out and saying it needs to be regulated by USDA. We want a level playing field in terms of our regulatory infrastructure, which is understandable. And I think that, but I think under the legal authorities that, as was pointed out by Deepti, that we really probably, if we're going to go under existing authorities, will have a dual jurisdiction on regulation. So I think one of the things that's happened with milk is that there wasn't a huge pushback in the beginning. First of all, because it was a fairly small market share, but the companies that were actually producing this product were dairy companies. So the dairy companies actually got into the plant-based milk businesses. I think the fact that what we just heard on the last panel, with the meat companies investing in some of the new cell-based technology companies, I think we're going to see, again, a coming together of the industry. I think the letter is a first start, showing that there's going to be some cooperation, discussion, that people do want to work together. And I think that this technology, as we've heard over the last today, it's going to take a while to really get to market. So we've got some time. And I think that's time to actually have more discussions with industry and really talk about what this product is, what it means, how we can work together to actually have a protein kind of conversation. One of the things is, I think the meat companies have been quicker to come to the table and determine that they're protein companies faster than the oil companies decided they were energy companies.
I think it's really interesting, Secretary Veneman, that you talk about the dairy companies really investing in plant-based milks, because we see the meat companies investing in both plant-based meat and clean meat.
Right.
But I think a lot of the opposition, both on the milk side and on the meat side, is with the small producers. So it's the dairy producers and the cattlemen themselves, rather than the companies.
It's the farmers that are concerned, because the companies, the processing companies, are getting into the businesses. And you have to think about the farmer on the ground. The dairy producers right now, in particular, have had quite low prices. We see in this state, in California, there's a tremendous number of dairies, both because of environmental regulation and because of aging populations, and the price of the product are going out of business. So we've seen a lot of the smaller farmers go out of business. In this state, you've seen it in Vermont, you've seen it in a lot of different states now, and I think there's a lot of pressure on the production side, the farmer side of these industries.
Secretary, let me ask you a follow-up on this. We've heard the term clean meat here a lot, and I know it's a term that you have some discomfort with, in part for reasons related to this question of how much do you antagonize the existing industry. Could you talk a little bit about the trade-offs there?
Yeah, I think there's a very strong reaction on the part of the industry itself about clean meat, because it implies that other meat is not clean. And I mean, it could even imply that your plant-based product is not clean, because you're not calling it clean, you're calling it plant-based.
I mean, just as a branding perspective, I don't think that's a good term. Food is from the earth, which is dirt and soil. I'm not involved in it, so I'm just giving a branding perspective, but that's how I look at it.
Yeah. So I think, in the letter, I think the two parties came to the term cell-based. I think the challenge is going to be, what is the term that's actually used to describe the product, and what is the descriptor? Plant-based is so much easier.
Yep, it is.
Because you can say plant-based product.
And it gives you a sense of what's in it. If you say something's clean meat, I still don't know what's in it, what it's made
meat.
of.
It's actually meat. It's from, it's animal cells. So I think
there
this
should be a descriptor that explains how you got there.
Deepti, I have a question for you about this.
I just want to say, I just think it's really, I'm always going to advocate for consumers having as much information as they can. And I think any attempt to not have a consumer have a full understanding of what they're consuming is going to be a challenge. From the Honest Tea side, we went through this issue where, not with Honest Tea, but the whole industry was trying to prevent the disclosure of GMOs in a product. And obviously the organic industry didn't have this issue, but big food industry tried to oppose the disclosure of GMOs on a package. And consumers, I think justifiably, rebelled, because consumers have a right to know what's in their food, how it's made, and how it got there.
Deepti, let me ask you something about watching this policymaking process happen. I'm a jaded, cynical journalist who reports on politics in Donald Trump's Washington. So sometimes I wonder whether or not these decisions are fully made on a rigorous view of the science at issue. There's ways of looking at these questions that are about the underlying argument, that are about the branding, and also that are about, maybe it really is a question of marshaling arguments on the science, or maybe it's a question of marshaling interest groups. Do you lean towards, having, again, seen all this get made, do you lean towards the more optimistic or the more cynical of those models for thinking about these political fights?
Well, I'm a cynic living in Washington too, by the way, so you're in good company. But I think that's why it's useful to remember that we've got laws on the books, right? You've got politics in Washington. Politics will always be in Washington. That's where the politics are supposed to be, I think. But what does the law say? So the law says that if you are a food, you're supposed to bear a name. And the name that you bear is either subject to a standard of identity, which is something that Congress put in place quite some time ago when there wasn't nutrition labeling and all the other labels that we have now on labels. And if there isn't a standard of identity, you must have a common or usual name. And that common or usual name must give you some sense of what that product is. It has to describe its basic integrity and essential characteristics. So there are USDA has at least 180 standards of identity for meat, poultry, and they are terms that range from things like ground beef and hamburger and things like that. And then FDA has got a whole host of standards of identity that are twice that. And so from the labeling perspective, the question is, do you meet those standards of identity or common or usual name? And for the milk question, the law that is triggered is whether you're purporting to be something that is standardized food. Well, if you say that you're almond milk and not just milk, which is the standard milk, it's not milk. Are you actually purporting to be milk, right? And so I think there will always be politics that play a role in food. But if we stay true to what the basic principles are, then I think that's a way to assure that politics doesn't interfere in the food so that you're precluding something from getting to market, right? Because the people that are sitting in Washington and the career staff that are sitting in the agencies, which I had the privilege of working with, they're bound by that law. It's their job to meet those statutory directives, and that's how we keep advancing forward. That's in my view, from a cynic in Washington.
One of the questions that I think all this raises, we're talking about changes to labeling or things that could happen going to the market, but there's also the question of the production process and who is regulating it and how. Jessica, could you talk a little bit about the ongoing debate over whether or not this should be FDA or USDA or joint, and sort of what some of the pros and cons of the different models would be?
Sure. So I assume it is clean meat, or what I call clean meat.
It is, so let's put plant-based meats and let's say cellular meats in different categories.
Sure. So it's very clear plant-based meats are regulated by FDA. There's no question. I don't think there's any debate. The debate on plant-based meats is whether they can use meat terms on the label. And sort of to get back to something Seth was saying, there is this Missouri law, and we have challenged that law and continue to challenge that law in the face of this enforcement memo, because we think that there shouldn't be these kinds of restrictions on the labels of plant-based producers. So Tofurky is a plaintiff in our litigation. The Animal Legal Defense Fund, which is here at the conference, and the ACLU of Missouri have joined GFI in bringing this litigation to really vigorously defend the rights of plant-based producers to label their foods using terms that consumers understand, very consistent with what we're talking about on plant-based milk. On the clean meat side, there is an open question about regulatory authority for clean pork, clean beef, clean chicken. There is no such debate when it comes to seafood other than catfish. So if you're talking about bluefin tuna, that is clearly only under FDA's authority. So then the question becomes, do we regulate this industry under FDA for the fish and USDA for the other kinds of meat, or FDA and USDA for the other kinds of meat, or do we put that under a single food agency? And if there are many ways to look at it. I think that FDA is particularly well situated to assess risks. And I think there's also a consensus that FDA is the best situated to look at this before it comes to market. So Secretary Veneman has referred to this letter that Memphis Meats and the North American Meat Institute sent to the White House recently. And it talks about FDA being the initial point of entry for clean meat and then USDA having a role to play. That's one possible approach. Another is that FDA does it all.
Before we get into the approach, let's say that I care about the success of this space, but I don't know if I care about this question. Why should I care where it ends up? Is this just a question of clarity, or does it go into FDA versus USDA versus joint? Does it matter in some profound way for the future of the industry?
It does matter in a profound way for the future of the industry. And the reason is because we need clarity. So, I think we all ultimately agree, however this shakes out, as long as clean meat comes to market in a clear and an efficient way and consumers have a choice, it doesn't matter if it's FDA, USDA, the two together, some mishmash. What we really don't want is for Congress to think that it needs to step in and solve this problem, or for this to be an issue where the two agencies are fighting over clean meat. And there are pros and cons to an FDA-only approach or of FDA and USDA approach. You know, there are significant differences between the way these two agencies think about labeling, the way they think about inspections and recalls. And so, you know, the industry needs to assess how they want to be regulated. I think there's also this issue of fairness. So one of the main reasons that the livestock and agriculture groups want USDA to be involved is because they want it to be a level playing field between them and their clean counterparts. But there's also an issue of fairness within the clean meat industry. So if clean fish is definitely under FDA, does it make sense for a different set of standards and rules to apply to other kinds of clean meat? And is that really fair? And what happens to the producer who's doing both or a mix?
I like the word fair here a lot, and I want to pick up on it. And this will go to you, Seth. This panel has the idea of level playing field at its heart. And there are a lot of ways to think about that, but one way that it often happens in politics is that we hit the starting stopwatch, and it's like a level playing field starting now. And anything that happens after now, that needs to be reintegrated. So there's a question up here, and we're not doing questions yet, but I think it gets to this well. You're talking about labeling, but you're really only talking about labeling anything new, anything we're not used to. GMOs are something we were not used to. One of the questions up here is that if cell-based meat is the best term because it describes a process, should conventional meat be slaughter-based meat? Now, if we were not in this room of hippies, that would just sound weird. But if we had never thought of killing animals for meat and just came up with it on Thursday, then the idea that you might want to label the fact that you're slaughtering a goat in order to have dinner would seem normal. So I'm curious what fairness actually means here, because so much gets read into the baseline to be very DC about it. So much becomes a status quo. And then what's fair and not fair becomes, I think, we're just talking about treating things with a regulatorily light touch, but things that are new get a higher level of scrutiny just by nature.
Well, so if you really want to talk about fairness, you could say the meat industry has been around for thousands of years, and we're all, sort of still in our first 10 years or less. So there's just an advantage of scale that the animal-based meat industry already has. I think, obviously the term chicken, turkey, beef, those are terms most people, I think all people, frankly, recognize currently is associated with being from an animal. So I don't think you need to say slaughtered chicken. I think chicken is chicken from a dead chicken. But I do think,
What about McNuggets? Where do they come from?
I won't touch that one. I do think that plant-based meat is new. I mean, obviously, there have been veggie burgers around for a long time, but this idea of plant-based meat is new. And frankly, it's only been less than 2 years that the meat section now has had products that are plant-based. So I do think the descriptors are critical. And here's what I will say. While obviously you could say the established industry has a huge starting advantage, it's clear that the new entrants have a dramatic advantage in terms of the momentum that we see from consumers. And there's so many other tailwinds going our way. We've never been interested in subsidies or anything else. Let's just give us a fair marketplace with accurate descriptors of what we're doing, and I think the consumer will take care of a lot of the rest.
Secretary, I want to pick up on that with you. The other piece of the level playing field question is that there's a lot in the current in, let's say, industrial agriculture system that goes unpriced. Environmental damage, arguably health questions and public health questions that fall on both private insurers and public insurers like Medicare and Medicaid. Should we, if we're really trying to think about level playing fields and fairness, should we be thinking about what does and doesn't get priced into these products ultimately? If we are paying the costs of industrial agriculture through the cost of global warming, through the cost of the healthcare system, but those costs are not appearing in the actual product, isn't the product underpriced?
That's an interesting way to put the question, I think.
Thank you.
I think to some extent the environmental costs are factored into some current agriculture. I mean, the regulatory burdens on farmers are things that they always complain about, whether it's water regulation or, meat regulation, or dairy in particular. But there's so I think there is a cost to the producer of some of the environmental requirements that they have to comply with. But I think the nutrition issue is a very interesting one. We are at a point where in this country, one of the biggest issues is healthcare. We are talking about it all the time. I do some work through something in Washington called and I don't live there. I'm the only one here that doesn't live in the Washington area, by the way. But I do some work with a group called the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we've been looking at this issue of the cost to the healthcare system of the obesity crisis in this country. And it goes right back to what people are eating, how they're taking care of themselves. But the food system is at the heart of this. Our last report that just looked at is, should we be subsidizing consumers through the food stamp program to buy soft drinks and other products in the food stamps when we're then subsidizing on the Medicaid side to pay for the health care that comes out of eating poor diets. So we have a really big issue about health care in this country. We have a big issue about climate. Actually, the nutrition issue is a global issue, as is climate's a global issue. But they're debated here. And food is at the center of both of those debates. One of the things I have been somewhat concerned about as I've sat here for the last 2 days is there's been very, very little discussion of nutrition, and there's very little nexus of how the food system should come together to really address the kinds of issues that we have to deal with, both on the environmental side and on the nutrition and healthcare side. We have 2/3 of the people in this country are now overweight. About 30% are obese. And that is really costing in terms of diabetes, cancer, heart disease. And, I think that this is a new part of the food industry. And I don't think that this part of the food industry can isolate itself from the nutrition discussion.
Deepti, I want to ask you a question adjacent to that one. I think when you hear this discussion, implicitly you might imagine what this industry should be hoping for is a very light regulatory touch. But if there is a clean meat or cell meat or plant-based meat or whoever group that comes up, or almond milk, and it makes a bunch of people sick, or to go to the point on nutrition, it turns out to be using an ingredient that 4 years down the road is carcinogenic at a high rate, it's going to be a huge shock to the entire industry. So to the extent that sometimes regulators keep industries from becoming their own worst enemy, what should groups here be hoping for on that score? Because for something this new, if the consumer begins to feel it's unsafe or it's untested, that's a real risk.
That's a great question. I think, when you are a new industry and you are getting your products to market, it's what your competitors or what others are doing affects you, because you're going to be combined, you're going to be considered together. And so it's critical that folks in this industry give thought to what their strategy is from a regulatory perspective. How will they demonstrate safety, not just so that they can check that box and get onto the market, but that they can develop consumer acceptance and trust. Because what happens at the beginning stays with you for some time. And that's why it's great to see companies like Memphis Meats thinking about what these issues mean for industry, and GFI thinking about what it means for the group as the whole, because your point is very well taken. If one of the first movers goes out there a little too fast and cuts some corners and doesn't assure safety in a way that it should, that's going to cast a shadow on others in this space. And I think it's critical that we not do that to assure the success of this very important industry.
So this next question will be the last one I ask to the panel. So people should take out Slido and aggressively add questions and vote. So the rest of this panel is super interesting too, because I've done a really good job. But if you don't step up with good questions, it's going to go downhill. But Jessica,
I get the last question.
I promised we would come back to the question of Memphis meats and the meat industry coming to an agreement on regulation. Because we've talked so much here with the idea that it will be oppositional and that kind of thing won't be easy, can you just talk a little bit about what that agreement is and how it came about? It strikes me as fascinating that at this point there is that kind of coalition being built.
So I can't speak to how that came about. Maybe some of the other panelists could. But I do think that it's an interesting letter. It's a recent development in clean meat, and really that it lays forward, it sets forth the kind of what Memphis Meats and the North American Meat Institute's vision is for how clean meat will be regulated. And I think it is monumental that the two entities came together. I also, I think it's an open question whether it's a position that the other clean meat companies will embrace. And I know that there are active conversations going on to really explore what that looks like for the whole industry and if this is a position that others will take.
Anything else on that letter from the panel before we move to Q&A?
Well, I'll add that what they're outlining in that letter is not unusual. If you look at what is in the statutes and the precedent, there's precedent there that outlines what that would look like. And they've offered to discuss with the regulators what it would mean for that sort of system. And so I think it's a very exciting development, and I'm hopeful that it'll get to a place where we have a clear regulatory path, or clearer.
While we're on this subject, there's a good question on this. Seth asks, FDA has a single mandate, consumer protection. USDA has a dual mandate, consumer protection and industry promotion. For this reason, shouldn't FDA be the preferred regulator for this industry?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. I think the question is whether FDA alone is a viable path forward, and whether USDA wants to have a role to play, and if so, how they fit into the regulatory framework. I think that's a really an astute observation that USDA has a dual mission to promote agriculture, and that includes traditional animal agriculture against which clean meat could potentially compete, right? And FDA does not have that same kind of dual mission. So I think that there is a general viewpoint that FDA alone would be the easiest path if it is a viable path. And the real question there is politics, not law. But I'm sure others have perhaps different views.
Seth, you gave a very politic answer earlier when we were talking about level playing fields. So I wanted to ask this one to you. Traditional animal agricultural companies seem to have advantages due to subsidies and being able to externalize costs. How do we level the playing field here?
Yeah, we're not interested in subsidies. I just want to be able to compete. So let us get to the shelf. Let us say what our product is. And, if anything, I want the American farmer to see this as an opportunity. If I'm a farmer and I can grow something to be fed to an animal that then gets fed to a human, I should not be able to make as much money if I grow a product that gets fed to a human. And so for us, we want the American farmer to see this as a great growth opportunity.
Okay, but I'm going to push you on this.
Okay.
What's the way to put this? So right now, the meat replacement industry, for all of its momentum and tailwinds, is tiny. The very important thing, if you care about these issues, is that it gets down into the commodity space as soon as possible, so that it's competing not just, Beyond Meat, it's great. I like it and can never find it, but it's expensive.
We're working on that.
It's more expensive than going to Costco and buying the 80-20 burgers.
Yeah.
So I recognize that some of that is technology,
And
but
scale.
if there are subsidies throughout the system, isn't part of having that level playing field and part of having this area scale at the level it can, changing that underlying structure?
I'd rather have the consumer on my side than the government on my side. And I just think this is, consumers see this and are gravitating toward it. Yes, we are more expensive now. We're still in the very infancy of our growth. We have absolute confidence that, over time we'll be able to underprice meat based on just being able to reach the kind of scale we expect to reach.
I'd love
Jessica,
to
it feels
jump
to
in
me
here.
like you'd like to.
Yeah,
come in
I
here.
would. And I do think that a level playing field is hugely important. And we're primarily focused on labeling. But I think another area to look at is checkoff programs. So checkoffs are mandatory fees that are paid by producers in a particular industry. And those fees go toward advertising that industry as a whole. And they've been criticized by small farmers, by specialty farmers, especially those who have higher environmental or animal welfare standards, because they don't want their dollars going into promoting the industry as a whole. They want to promote their brand and their, kind of better product. These checkoff funds have also been used for anti-competitive ways, and I think the most notable is that the American Egg Board very clearly tried to keep Just Mayo off of shelves of supermarkets because they didn't want consumers to have access because it would compete with egg-based mayonnaise. And so reforming checkoff programs is incredibly important. And we have champions in the Senate, Senators Mike Lee of Utah and Cory Booker of New Jersey, Republican and a Democrat, who are seeking to make these programs better and more fair for all of the producers and ensuring transparency, because it has been very, very difficult for producers who don't want to participate or who have problems with these checkoff programs to criticize them, and there's Supreme Court law on that.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand these checkoff programs are basically a tax that the producers vote on themselves. So they vote on it. And these became extremely contentious.
Can you just define the programs a little bit, how they work a bit more? The checkoff programs?
The producer groups come together and they agree to basically have an assessment, a tax on themselves, and that money is to be used for promotion of the product, advertising, health promotion, health, research. They use research on the products and so forth.
This is like the got milk or the incredible edible egg or pork the other way meat.
Right,
when you
or
start going
the
across
tempting
categories.
raisins way back when, that was all checkoff money. So the egg issue, though, became quite important because it forced the government to say, yes, these are quasi-governmental agencies that have to release their documents under the Freedom of Information Act. Then they tried to get a law that prevented that, which I think was successfully stopped.
Yes.
But I think, we don't know, for example, when cell-based meat comes into the system, there is no way to put that into the assessment because it's on a per-head basis right now. Yeah. So that's another way down the road issue that at some point is going to have to be addressed. But, I think some of these programs, I don't know how long they'll continue to be voted in. People do object to them if they didn't vote for them. And in fact, they are, sort of, again, it's a tax on the industry that they vote on themselves.
It also gets very complicated. I mean, eggs, I guess you could say, is fairly clear what an egg is, but if we're talking at least in the plant-based side, well, what if it's vegetarian, not vegan? How do you define it? The organic industry went through a whole attempt to try to have a checkoff program, and frankly, I just stayed out of it because I'd just rather compete in the marketplace than have the whole political bureaucracy thing around.
Jessica, there are a couple questions on here, going back to the question of talking about clean meat. So we've heard some of the argument against calling it clean meat, but folks here say they would like to hear more of the Good Food Institute's argument for calling it clean meat. If it's going to create all this opposition, why give it that name in the first place? What's the case?
Well, I think ultimately we're pragmatic. So if there's a better name, we will adopt that. And I think, how we define better is consumer acceptance, industry acceptance, whether it's, I know that there's this proposal to call it cell-based meat, whether the other companies in the space want to adopt that, and how regulators will think about it. So clean meat is a shorthand, and we don't probably think that it's going to end up on labels, really, but it's a way to talk to consumers about this industry, which is real meat but it's made in a different way. And we use clean meat as an analogy to clean energy because it is much more efficient than traditional forms of meat production, but it also is a nod to the clean environment in which clean meat will be produced. So we won't have the same kinds of pathogens that might be present in traditional meat production or processing.
Deepti, I'd like to ask you a question on here because I don't understand what it means at all. Somebody asked, does capital G, capital R, capital A, capital S, grass, apply to cultured meat?
So GRAS refers to generally recognized as safe. So what that means is right now, in 1958, Congress amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to give FDA pre-market authority over food additives. What is a food additive? A food additive is something that reasonably becomes a component of food unless it is generally recognized as safe. At that time, what Congress was looking at was chemicals added to food. There was a real concern that those chemicals could lead to cancer. And so if you are a food additive, you're subject to pre-market review before FDA unless you're generally recognized as safe. And so if you're in an ingredient, and when you live in a world where everything is almost a multi-ingredient food except for produce, and you are a new ingredient or potentially new ingredient, what you can do is you can demonstrate that you are generally recognized as safe, GRAS, to FDA. And that's called a GRAS notification. And so the FDA has a whole series of GRAS notifications that apply to ingredients that are used in plant-based products, as well as meat and poultry products, because FDA's food additive authority extends to both. And so if something is an ingredient used in meat or poultry that is potentially new, you can demonstrate that it's GRAS by submitting that to FDA or making your self-determination.
Secretary Veneman, this is a question that's directed to you. What is FDA, but I'll open this up, USDA, et cetera, doing to shorten the time they take to come up with regulations and laws to support a more fast-changing market and technology space?
Well, I mean, I haven't been living in Washington for a long time to be able to talk about what exactly they're doing at this point. I mean, the reason I brought up the organic regs, and they did take an extraordinarily long time, was because there was so much interest in them. And there were so many comments that came in about how to build a brand new industry. Now, we in California, and I was Secretary of Agriculture in California during the time a lot of this regulatory process was going on, we already had regulations out here. We had we kind of led the way on organic labeling. And, but what we found is there were so many variables that came into the discussion in building this new industry. And I think this is one of the reasons that people are somewhat concerned about trying to do any new kind of statutory changes, because we do think that there are existing authorities under which we can regulate the whole cellular-based meat structure. So it depends on the regulation. Sometimes they're pretty simple to put into place. They don't take that much time. But all regulations do take some time because you have to open them up for public comment. And it depends on how much feedback you get. You may have to reopen them because of the issues that were raised, that you have to rewrite them, reopen the comment period, and it becomes a very lengthy process. And in fact, it was a full 10-year period for the organic regs.
And I just want to add on that from the GRAS point of view. So at FDA's public meeting in July 12th, which many people have referenced here today, what FDA outlined was their framework for how they determine if something is generally recognized as safe or safe if it's an ingredient of biological origin. So what you were hearing from FDA is explain, well, this is how we determine safety. This is how we look at safety for new or potentially new foods. So FDA is applying its pre-existing authorities, which have been around for some time, to this technology. And, arguably you wouldn't need a brand new rule to do that because those regulations are based on general principles. And that's what we were hearing from the agency.
Looming over this discussion, Seth, has been the question of political power. And so somebody asks, and I think this is a good one for you, what are the thoughts around this emergent industry building a coalition, starting a trade association, beginning to intentionally build a lobby of its own?
So we are members of the Plant-Based Food Association, and we are working jointly with other members to, for example, develop our own standards. In the absence of government standards, we're trying to develop our own standards for what we think are the proper way to label and merchandise plant-based meat products. Once again, so that I think is a useful effort and hopefully constructive. But in general, the whole lobbying thing to me just is sort of speaks to the abuse of power of industry, and I'd just rather stay out of it and, like I say, connect with the consumer. And as long as there's no barriers for us being able to market our products and make them available to the consumer, that's the only thing I'd be, that would sort of get me into the trenches if that became an issue.
I noticed a lot of micro expressions across your face, Jessica. Do you want
Me?
to jump in?
Why, thank you. I think that perhaps that question was geared to the clean meat space, because there is a trade association for plant-based
The question
products.
was unclear, so it didn't give me much guidance.
Yeah, so the clean meat companies don't have a trade association, and I think there's a real need for the companies to come together on a shared regulatory strategy and lobbying too. Even if we don't want to proactively be seeking legislation, and I'm not sure that's the right approach, because there are ways to ask for more R&D funding for clean meat and other things that could help the industry, we at least need to be thinking about how this industry can fight off threats. So right now there is a provision in the House Agriculture Spending Bill that would require USDA to create regulations about clean meat, and that would directly undermine the work that FDA is doing. And a couple of the companies have been doing some work on the Hill, and GFI has been doing some work on the Hill, but there's certainly a real need to make sure that both the authorizers, so the agencies who are in charge of the legislators who are in charge of the agencies, as well as the appropriators, those who are deciding how much money they have to spend, hear that that's a foolish path forward. So there's a real need for this industry to come together, and I think the timing is good for a coalition or a trade association for this industry.
Yeah, I think the other reason for the industry to come together is really to look at, how do you go forward? I mean, one of the issues that I think this industry faces is how are you going to educate people on what this really is? The regulators. I mean, people they aren't trained in this. I mean, we've heard a lot of scientific discussion. The regulators need to be educated, but more importantly, people on the Hill. I mean, they're being told sometimes by industry groups the big fear factor, but there's a real education that needs to go on, and I think there needs to be a consistent message from the industry. The other thing I think a trade association or an organization, it doesn't necessarily have to be a trade association that lobbies, but they can come together on what is appropriate regulation. How do we protect the food supply? Because as was stated before, if you have one bad player in the space and there's a food safety problem in particular, I mean, it will really undermine the industry for a long time.
I cannot tell you how much I wish I'd had the foresight to make it possible to play Regulators as a way to end this panel, for those who know that song. But in the absence of that, please join me in thanking our illustrious panelists.